Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going right back to the beginning.
The very beginning, yeah. The book of Genesis.
Exactly. And we've got some great material to help us unpack it.
We do. We're looking at the Genesis text itself from the ESV Bible, plus the ESV Study Bible notes for context, and John MacArthur study notes, too, for some detailed insights.
So, the mission today.
Well, the idea is to really dig into the key themes, get a feel for the original historical setting, and, consider some of the ways we can approach interpreting this foundational book.
Okay, foundational is definitely the word. So let's get started with the basics. The title, who's traditionally thought to have written it and when?
Right. So traditionally, it's known as the first book of Moses. We also call it Genesis, which, well, it basically means origins or beginnings.
Makes sense.
And yeah, authorship is generally attributed to Moses. That's a long-held view supported within the Pentateuch itself.
Okay. And the timing. When was this likely written down?
The common understanding, based on our sources, is during the Israelites' time in the wilderness, after they left Egypt.
Right, the Exodus generation.
Exactly. And that context is, well, it's absolutely key to understanding why it was written.
Okay, so paint that picture for us. You've got this whole group of people. They've just had this massive upheaval, leaving Egypt. Now they're in the desert. What does Genesis offer them specifically? What questions is it answering?
Yeah, I mean, you have to imagine this wasn't just like ancient history for them. It was explaining their present.
How so?
Well, Genesis sets out to establish their identity, explaining their origins, reminding them of God's promises to their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. It provides the whole basis for the covenant relationship they were stepping into with God.
So answering the who are we question.
Precisely. And also the really big questions, the words we still ask, right? Where did the world come from? Why is there suffering? Why'd things go wrong? Genesis tackles those head on. It talks about creation, humanity, the origin of sin and how its effects just spread, and importantly, God's very first hints of a plan for redemption.
Wow. So it's giving them roots, a framework for their relationship with God, and answers to these huge existential questions, all while they're wandering in the desert.
That's the idea. It was profoundly relevant to their immediate situation.
Okay, so it's clearly important for them. But stepping back, what's its wider significance, historically, theologically? Why is Genesis so foundational for, well, everything that follows?
Oh, its importance is, it's hard to overstate, really. It's the bedrock for the rest of the Old Testament narrative. And honestly, you can't fully grasp the New Testament without understanding Genesis.
Right.
It introduces God as the sovereign creator, the ultimate authority, the ruler over everything. And it's where we first encounter these huge theological concepts, these core doctrines.
Like what specifically?
Well, creation itself, obviously. Then the fall of humanity. The concept of sin is this fundamental problem, but also the promise of redemption that comes after the fall.
Even that early on.
Yes, right away. And then you have the idea of covenant, these formal agreements God makes, and election, God's sovereign choice. It's all introduced right there.
And the people too, right? The lineage.
Absolutely. It traces that line meticulously from Adam right down to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They're absolutely central to Israel's self-understanding, and Genesis tells their stories.
That's a lot packed into one book. So these big ideas, these doctrines you mentioned, do they stand out as recurring themes throughout Genesis?
Definitely. You see several major themes woven all the way through. Creation's the first one, obviously. God intentionally, powerfully creating everything just by speaking.
And God said.
Exactly. That repetition really hammers home his active, deliberate role. Then there's covenant. And like we said, these aren't just casual promises. They're formal binding agreements. God establishes these key covenants, especially with Abraham and his descendants.
Promising land, descendants, blessing.
Right. Then, unavoidably, there's the theme of sin and its consequences. It starts in the garden with that act of disobedience, but you see its ripple effects throughout the subsequent stories, Cain and Abel, the flood.
It just cascades.
It does. But, and this is crucial, woven right into that, is the theme of redemption and promise. Even with the immediate consequences of the fall, God doesn't just, give up. He offers that first hint of restoration, the proto-evangelium.
The promise of hope, even then?
Yes. And finally, there's election, God's sovereign choice, choosing specific people, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and ultimately a nation, for his particular purposes.
Okay, so creation, covenant, sin, promise, election. Those are some weighty themes. It sounds like interpreting a book with all that going on might present some challenges.
Oh, absolutely. It's not always straightforward.
Yeah.
One of the big challenges is just balancing the different aspects of the text. You've got history, but also different literary styles, narrative, poetry, genealogies, and deep theological messages all intertwined. How do they relate?
Right. And the obvious one, science.
Yeah, that's probably the most talked about challenge. How do you understand the creation account, particularly Genesis 1 and 2, in relation to modern scientific discoveries about the origins of the universe and life? There are many different approaches there.
It requires careful thought.
It does. And you also have to consider the context. Understanding symbolic language, understanding the ancient Near Eastern world from which it came. Those cultures had different ways of expressing things than we do.
And people have interpreted passages differently for centuries, right?
Exactly. So navigating those different interpretations, understanding where they come from, that's part of the process too. It requires a certain humility and a willingness to wrestle with the text.
That makes sense. It's not simple. Now, you mentioned John MacArthur's notes. He offers a structure for the book, breaking it down. Could you walk us through that?
Yeah, MacArthur's outline is pretty helpful. He divides Genesis into two main parts. Part 1 covers chapters 1 through 11. He calls this primeval history.
Primeval, meaning like the earliest times,
Yeah.
universal history.
Exactly. It's the big picture, early human history.
Yeah.
So you have creation in chapters 1 and 2, then the fall in chapter 3, which is just pivotal, showing how sin fractures everything, relationship with God, relationships between
It
people.
sets the stage for conflict.
Totally. Then chapters 4 through 9 cover the spread of that sin and God's judgment Cain and Abel, the flood narrative. And this section wraps up with the Tower of Babel in chapters 10 and 11, explaining the origin of different nations and languages.
Okay, so that's the first broader section. What's the second part?
Part 2 runs from chapter 12 all the way to 50. MacArthur calls this patriarchal history. Here, the focus narrows right down.
From universal to specific.
Right. It zooms in on the specific family line God chose to work through. So you get the detailed stories of Abraham in chapters 12 to 25, then Isaac, mostly in chapter 26, then Jacob, that's chapters 27 to 36, and finally Joseph, whose story takes up chapters 37 to 50.
And Joseph's story leads into Exodus.
Precisely. It sets the stage for the Israelites ending up in Egypt, which is where the next book picks up. So primeval history, then patriarchal history. It's a clear shift.
That structure really helps clarify the flow of the book. Okay, as we've gone through all this, the text, the notes, the context, what are some of the things that really jumped out at you? Key takeaways, maybe some surprising facts or points of emphasis.
Well, a few things really stand out. That constant refrain in chapter 1, and God said, it just underscores his active, powerful, intentional role in creation. It wasn't accidental.
Great, very deliberate.
Yeah. Also, the immediacy of the consequences after the disobedience in the garden. It's a stark picture of how sin works, how quickly it messes things up.
No delay, really.
No. But then, what's maybe surprising, or at least really significant, is how early that promise of redemption appears. Right there in Genesis 3, after the fall. It shows God's grace is there from the beginning, alongside the judgment.
That's powerful.
It is. And then there's that shift we just talked about, from the universal history of chapters 1-11 to the very specific focus on Abraham's family from chapter 12 onwards. It highlights how God's big plan starts working through particular people.
And not always perfect people either.
Not at all. That's another key takeaway. God's sovereignty in choosing and using individuals who are clearly flawed. Think about Jacob, He's deceptive, struggles, yet God works through him. It shows God's purposes aren't dependent on human perfection.
That's actually quite encouraging in a way.
I think so. And finally, just how much foreshadowing there is in the patriarchal stories. You see glimpses of future redemptive themes, things that get fully developed later in the Bible, hinted at in the lives of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph.
So Genesis is packed with these layers. Okay, let's try to wrap this up. If you had to summarize the absolute core significance of Genesis based on everything we've looked at.
I'd say Genesis is, well, it's the indispensable foundation. It sets the stage for the entire biblical narrative of God's relationship with humanity and his plan for redemption.
It establishes the starting point.
Exactly. It introduces God as the sovereign, purposeful creator. It reveals the reality and the devastating consequences of sin. But crucially, it also reveals God's initial promises of hope. his faithfulness through covenant, and his sovereign choice, his election.
So it's not just an origin story.
No, it's much more. It's the theological and historical bedrock for understanding who God is, who we are, the problem of sin, and the beginnings of God's solution.
It
Shapes
does.
everything that comes after.
Absolutely. Foundational is definitely the right word. It really provides the framework you need to understand so much of what follows in the Bible and even, wider theological discussions.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you, our listener, to maybe ponder after this deep dive. Considering these massive themes we've talked about, creation, the fall, God's promise, covenants, how do you see those ideas playing out today? How do they still resonate? And what impact might they have on how you understand the world and maybe even your own place within this grand story that begins right here in Genesis? Something to really mull over.